My parents forced me to pay for their mistakes. I refused and discovered their dirty secrets. I never imagined my parents would turn on me. One morning, just as I was sipping my coffee, my mother stormed into my living room, eyes raging with an anger I'd never seen. She handed me a stack of overdue bills, her bills, and demanded I pay them off immediately. My father stood behind her, silent but nodding in agreement, his arms crossed as if daring me to refuse. I tried to protest, reminding them that I had my obligations, a mortgage, student loans, and the everyday costs of living. But they didn't care. "You owe us," my mother hissed, her voice trembling. "After all we've done for you, it's the least you can do." At first, I felt shock ripple through my chest. These were the people who'd raised me, the ones I was supposed to trust without question. But now they were cornering me, insisting that their past decisions, bad investments, reckless spending, were my responsibility. When I stood my ground and said no, the fury in my parents' eyes was replaced by something worse, a chilling threat that hinted they weren't above tearing our family apart. And that was only the beginning. They thought they could manipulate me into paying for their mistakes, but they didn't realize that I was about to stumble upon secrets far more devastating than a few overdue bills. And once I uncovered those truths, there would be no going back. My name is Emberly, and if you met me just a few months ago, you would have seen a different person, someone who believed fiercely in family unity and the power of unconditional love. I grew up in a modest, two-story house in a quiet suburb. On most evenings after school, I do my homework at the dining room table while my mother cooked dinner and my father read the newspaper. Nothing felt more comforting than the hum of our dishwasher and the scent of freshly baked bread. For the longest time, I believed that my parents' best qualities were their warmth and generosity. They never missed a high school dance recital or a parent-teacher conference. They always encouraged me to pursue my dreams, even if they seemed out of reach. Back then, my biggest concerns were typical teenage anxieties, grades, friendships, and whether I'd get into a decent college. Money was never an issue we openly discussed. We weren't wealthy, but my parents both held steady jobs, so I assumed we were doing just fine. My mother worked as an office manager at a local construction firm, and my father spent years at a printing company. Occasionally, I'd overhear hushed arguments about late credit card statements or the rising cost of our mortgage, but they'd quickly change the subject if I walked into the room. In hindsight, those conversations were the first ominous signs that my parents struggled more than they admitted. Perhaps, if I had paid closer attention back then, I'd have braced myself for the storm that was about to uproot my world. By the time I entered college, I was living off scholarships, part-time jobs, and some small financial help from my parents. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until one winter break, I came home to find their moods drastically changed. Our once cozy home felt heavy with tension. I noticed my mother flinch every time the phone rang, and my father started spending more nights pacing in the backyard, alone with his thoughts. They were still too proud, or maybe too afraid, to tell me what was wrong. Instead, they'd plaster on half-hearted smiles and encourage me to keep working hard at school as if everything was perfectly normal. After graduating, I was eager to become more independent. I landed a decent job at a marketing agency in the city, and I moved into a small studio apartment. My parents said they were proud of me, and for a while, it seemed as if we had settled into a new, healthy rhythm: holiday visits, phone calls, and the occasional family dinner. Still, every so often, I'd sense something unspoken simmering beneath our cheerful conversations. My mother's eyes would dart away when I asked how work was going, or my father would quickly change the topic whenever I brought up finances. Looking back, I see how naive I was. I trusted them to be honest with me if they needed help. Of course, I would have jumped at the chance to support them had they asked. But they never did, at least, not until that fateful morning when my mother stormed in, slammed a pile of overdue bills on my coffee table, and demanded that I step up and bail them out. That's when I realized everything I thought I knew about my parents, and my place in this family was about to unravel in ways I couldn't have imagined. On the surface, my mother, Regina, always seemed like the strong one, a natural leader who could organize a church bake sale in an hour or negotiate a discount at any store. She had a magnetic presence. People gravitated toward her, drawn to her easy charm and quick smile. My father, Daniel, was her opposite. Soft-spoken and reserved, he preferred the corner of any crowded room, content to observe rather than engage. As a child, I admired how well they fit together, like two puzzle pieces that compensated for the other's weaknesses. Where my mother was bold and assertive, my father was reflective and patient. Together, they formed the stable foundation of my life, or so I believed. Yet behind their outward stability, each carried unspoken tensions. My mother's need for control went beyond party planning or home decor. She craved the appearance of success, of being the perfect mother with the perfect home. While other families in our neighborhood drove practical sedans, she insisted on upgrading to luxury SUVs every few years, even if it meant stretching our budget. My father, meanwhile, harbored quieter ambitions and frustrations. He worked for decades at a printing company, dreaming of starting his own business someday, yet he never took the risk. Each year that passed without a promotion or entrepreneurial leap tightened the knot of discontent in his chest. Growing up, I noticed small cracks in their dynamic. Sometimes, I'd hear them whispering arguments late at night, my father complaining about money, my mother shooting back that he needed to act like a real provider. He'd snap, "You're the one who wants a bigger house and fancier cars." But these tensions never erupted in front of me. By morning, they'd be back to their usual roles, my father reading the newspaper, my mother packing my lunch with a chipper smile. From a young age, I learned to be a people pleaser, especially with my mom. I excelled in school, hoping my straight A's would soothe her ongoing anxieties about status and appearance. I signed up for extracurricular activities, dance classes, debate club, so she could boast about my achievements to the neighbors. My father would occasionally step in, gently suggesting, "Let Emberly rest," but he rarely pushed back against her more forceful personality. Instead, he often retreated into long hours of work or his solitary backyard pacing, letting my mother's ambition shape our family's trajectory. When I went off to college, they paid for what they could, but I always sensed their reluctance to reveal how tight money was. My scholarships and part-time jobs mostly covered my tuition, and I felt guilty about the remaining expenses I put on their plate. I told myself they had it under control. After all, Regina and Daniel had never let me see them buckle under financial pressure before. They were parents, I assumed they had a plan. Their attitudes shifted drastically once I graduated and got a decent paycheck of my own. My mother was the first to drop hints, little comments about being overwhelmed or stressed whenever I visited. My father's eyes seemed more haunted, as though he were keeping some dark secret. At first, I offered small help, like groceries or covering a dinner tab here and there. But any mention of real debt or deeper issues was brushed off with a tense smile. "We're fine," they'd say. "We just need to get back on our feet." Only later would I learn how bad things truly were, how many layers of debt they'd amassed, how desperate they were to maintain appearances. By the time my mother stormed into my apartment with that stack of overdue bills, I began to realize their demands for my money were more than a simple request for help. It was a forced ultimatum. And it wouldn't stop at a few mortgage payments. Little did they know, their pushy move would lead me straight into uncovering the lies and secrets they had worked so hard to bury. The pressure started quietly at first, like a leaky faucet you barely notice. After my mother's explosive demand that I settle her overdue bills, I agreed to look over them, hoping it was just a few months of missed payments I could help with. But as I read through the statements, I noticed multiple credit cards I'd never heard her mention. Some belonged to my father, others were joint accounts. The balances were astronomical, far beyond what I could handle, even if I'd wanted to empty my savings. When I showed her the statements and said I could only afford a small fraction, her face hardened. "You're not trying hard enough," she said, her tone soaked in disappointment. "You make decent money at that marketing agency. How can you say no to your own family?" My father, who was usually the more temperate one, just stood off to the side, nodding whenever my mother spoke. Something in his eyes told me he was ashamed but had resigned himself to her methods. Within days, the phone calls to my cell phone began. "Hello, is this Emberly?" an unfamiliar voice would ask. "We understand you're the new contact for Regina and Daniel's accounts." Confusion rattled me, my parents had listed my phone number as the contact on multiple bills. I called my mother in a panic. She breezily replied, "Well, you said you'd help, didn't you? The collectors need someone reliable to talk to." It wasn't just medical bills or minor credit debt, there were delinquent tax payments, lapsed insurance policies, and even a notice from a private lender. Each call hammered home just how deep their financial troubles were. My anxiety shot through the roof. I started losing sleep, dreading the next voicemail. I tried approaching my mother with reason, suggesting we consolidate their debts and maybe work with a financial counselor. But she brushed off every idea. "I'm not letting a stranger rifle through our private details," she snapped. "We'll handle this our way." That's when I realized our way really meant my way, or else. Then came the night my father came to see me alone. I was sitting in my apartment, sorting through another wave of overdue notices, when he gently knocked on the door. He began softly, I know this looks bad. He glanced around my living room, his eyes flitting over the half-eaten sandwich and the stack of papers on the coffee table. Your mother's in panic mode. She's afraid of losing the house. We're behind on the mortgage, car payments, everything. I asked him, point blank, how did you let it get this far? Didn't you see it coming? He sighed heavily, and, for a moment, I saw the guilt swimming behind his downcast eyes. I tried to talk to her about cutting back, about the credit cards, but she wouldn't hear it. She said we had to keep up appearances. She refused to believe we couldn't claw our way out on our own. Then he fell silent as if he'd already said too much. Sympathy for him welled up in me. I felt the old, familiar urge to solve everyone's problems, to keep our family afloat. But it was overshadowed by a burning sense of betrayal. Why didn't you warn me before it came to this? I demanded. Why list me on these accounts without asking me? This could destroy my credit, my reputation if something goes wrong. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I'm sorry, he said quietly. We had no choice. That phrase, no choice, echoed in my head. I felt my frustration boiling. There's always a choice, I countered. You're just making me pay the price for yours. A week later, things got worse. The sum they asked for climbed steadily, each day revealing some new overdue payment I'd supposedly volunteered to settle. When I refused to fork over my savings, my mother escalated her tactics. She started showing up at my workplace unannounced. Once, she even cornered me in the lobby, her voice shrill as she accused me of deserting my flesh and blood. Coworkers looked on, wide-eyed, as she practically scolded me in public. I felt humiliated, tears stinging my eyes, but I tried to keep calm. Mom, stop, I whispered urgently, pulling her aside. We can't do this here. We can't. She yanked her arm away. Oh, now you're worried about appearances, she snapped, loud enough that a few more heads turned our way. So was I, Emberly. That's why we're in this situation, to begin with. At that moment, I realized her sense of reason had shriveled down to one overriding desire, to extract money by any means necessary to keep her lifestyle, or at least the facade of it, intact. She didn't care if she embarrassed me in front of my coworkers or ruined my professional image. And as she stormed out, I sank into a nearby chair, my cheeks blazing with a mix of anger and shame. Later that evening, I received a surprising call from a woman named Tessa, a family friend I hadn't spoken to in years. She hesitated before explaining that she'd lent my parents a substantial amount of money months earlier, which they'd never repaid. My mother had used me as a reference, claiming I would vouch for them if Tessa had any concerns. Horrified, I apologized profusely, but Tessa just sighed. You should know, she said softly, your parents aren't being honest. They said they were using the money for a medical emergency, but I've seen Regina driving a new SUV around. Please be careful. The conversation left me nauseated. My parents had used a sob story to manipulate someone else's kindness, someone outside the family. And apparently, I was unknowingly part of their con. It wasn't just about paying off existing bills now. They were in a cycle of taking from anyone gullible enough to help, spinning web after web of deception. Desperate to get to the bottom of it, I started digging into public records, searching for any legal issues under my parents' names. That's when I discovered multiple liens placed against them. One was from a local contractor who claimed they'd stiffed him after an expensive kitchen renovation. Another was for unpaid property taxes, dating back 2 years. But the biggest shock was a pending lawsuit from a private investor, a real estate deal gone sour. My father's signature was on the agreement, but his name alone hadn't qualified for the loan amount. Curiously, there was a second cosigner. My mother had forged my name. I stared at the scanned document on my laptop, my breath hitching. The ink might have been digital, but the signature was a clumsy imitation of my own. How long had they been planning this? How far were they willing to go? A cold anger twisted in my gut. This was no longer a simple matter of them needing some help to make ends meet. They'd dragged me into financial corruption, forging my identity on a document for a real estate gamble that had utterly collapsed. Armed with this information, I knew I had to confront them. I could no longer dance around their manipulations. But before I could plan my next move, I received a text from my mother, family meeting at our house, 7 p.m. tomorrow. Be there. This is non-negotiable. My heart pounded as I read it. Every cell in my body told me that this was the tipping point, the moment when all our secrets, lies, and accusations would clash head-on. Part of me wanted to run, disappear, and save myself from the looming disaster. But I knew I couldn't back down. Not anymore. Because now I had proof of how far they'd gone, and I wasn't about to let them drag me under without a fight. I arrived at my parents' house with my nerves taut as piano wires. Even the driveway radiated tension. My mother's new SUV, courtesy of her never-ending credit cycle, loomed large beside my father's aging sedan. A wave of childhood memories washed over me as I stepped onto the porch, the summers spent riding my bike around this neighborhood, the nights gazing at stars from the front yard. This house had once been a haven. Now, it felt like hostile territory. Inside, the living room was staged as though for a formal meeting, not a family gathering. The curtains were drawn, the coffee table had been cleared of its usual magazines, and 2 chairs had been placed conspicuously in the center of the room. My father stood near the fireplace, his posture rigid, while my mother sat at one end of the sofa, arms crossed. There was no sign of any attempt at a friendly hug or even a cordial greeting. The silence pressed heavily against my ears. Sit, my mother commanded, gesturing toward one of the chairs. I glanced at my father, hoping for a gentler invitation, but his gaze darted nervously to the floor. Without a word, he sank into the second chair, leaving me to stand there, feeling like I was on trial. Finally, I lowered myself into the chair, heart thumping. My mother's eyes locked onto me, sharper than I'd ever seen them. We need to settle this once and for all, she began, her tone clipped. I've been talking to your father, and we agree that you're our best hope to stabilize everything. You have a stable income and no major expenses other than your apartment. It makes sense for you to help us financially until we clear this mess. My mind reeled at the sheer audacity. Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, this isn't a simple fix. Your debts are massive. Even if I gave you every penny I have, it wouldn't cover a fraction of what you owe. And that's before we get into forging my signature on that real estate document. As soon as the words left my mouth, I saw my mother's cheeks flush red. For a split second, her mask of indignation cracked, revealing raw panic underneath. My father's eyes widened, confirming what I already knew. He'd been dreading the moment I confronted them about the forgery. My mother recovered quickly. I don't know what you're talking about, she snapped. We never forget anything. You're making accusations without proof. I inhaled slowly, counting to 3 to maintain control. Then, from my bag, I pulled out the scanned copy of the contract bearing my name, complete with the faked signature. Then explain this, I said quietly, holding up the document so they both could see. My father opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged. My mother's rage flared. Where did you get that? She demanded, her voice shaking. The county courthouse website, I replied, trying not to let my anger spiral. It's public record when someone files a lawsuit. You used my name as a cosigner on a real estate loan. That's not just immoral, it's illegal. A moment of tense silence filled the room. My father broke first, his voice hushed. Regina, I told you this was a bad idea, he said, looking at my mother with an anguished expression. I told you Emberly would find out eventually. My mother whipped around, glaring at him. You told me we had no choice, she shouted, and her voice cracked under the weight of blame. You said if we didn't get that loan, we'd lose the house. Stop pretending this is about the house, I interjected, my frustration finally boiling over. You took that loan to fund another renovation, why, so you could impress the neighbors? Keep up appearances you can't afford? She sprang to her feet, eyes blazing. You have no idea what we've been through, she hissed. I sacrificed so much for this family. What sacrifices, Mom? I retorted, raising my voice for the first time. Buying SUVs and redecorating every 2 years? Borrowing money left and right, telling lies to people like Tessa? You threatened me with blackmail at my job, humiliated me in front of my coworkers, and forged my signature on a legal document. None of that sounds like a sacrifice. It sounds like a scam. My father buried his face in his hands. It's true, Emberly, he finally said. We borrowed money from Tessa under pretenses. We wanted to make a quick flip on a real estate deal and pay her back with interest. But the market tanked, and we lost everything. Your mother was desperate. I let out a hollow laugh. Desperate enough to commit fraud? My mother's voice turned shrill. We're your parents. Don't you owe us loyalty? The sheer entitlement in her words knocked the breath out of me. Oh, you? You forged my name, I repeated, anger trembling through me. You put me at risk of legal repercussions. I could be prosecuted for something I never even knew about. She cast a glance at my father as though begging for backup, but he had none to give. He just stared at the floor, guilt etched into every crease of his face. That was when it hit me. My father was complicit, but in some twisted way, he was also a victim, intimidated by my mother's iron will, too passive to stop her from crossing boundaries. Still, that didn't excuse his silence. Okay, my mother said, lowering her voice in a conciliatory tone that felt more like a threat. Let's not forget how much we've done for you, Emberly. We put you through college, fed you, clothed you. You think all that was free? I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my composure. I got scholarships, Mom. And you know what? I worked part-time jobs for the entire 4 years. What you contributed was minimal compared to what I had to do on my own. And even if you had paid for all of it, that doesn't give you the right to break the law in my name. A crack of thunder sounded from outside, as if on cue. My father raised his head, tears shimmering in the corners of his eyes. Please, he said softly. We can't do this. This family. But my mother cut him off. If you don't want to help us, fine, she spat, turning her full fury back on me. We'll tell everyone you refused. We'll tell them you never cared about this family. See how that looks when you're trying to climb the corporate ladder. People love a tragic story about a daughter who abandoned her parents. I snorted in disbelief. So that's it? Blackmail me with lies if I don't give you what you want. I've got news for you, I'm done. I'm done with the phone calls, the threats, the forging of signatures. If you want a war, I'll tell the police everything. I have the documents to prove what you did. My mother's face paled. For a moment, I thought she might physically lunge at me. Then, her expression collapsed into a facade of wounded pride. You'd call the cops on your mother, she asked, her voice trembling with either rage or heartbreak, maybe both. I stood up, my knees shaking, but my resolve was unbreakable now. If it means protecting myself from your fraud, yes. Don't think I won't do it. My father tried to reach out, clutching my hand, tears brimming in his eyes. Emberly, please, he whispered. We can find another way. I squeezed his hand back, but gently withdrew. I tried to find another way, I said, my voice hoarse with exhaustion. You both refused every reasonable solution I offered. This is the bed you made. Lightning flashed through the curtains, momentarily illuminating the stark fear in my mother's gaze. I turned away, not waiting for her next barrage of demands or pleas. My heart pounded so fiercely I could feel it echo in my skull. As I stepped back into the stormy night, I sensed that my departure was more than physical, it was symbolic. I was walking out of their manipulative orbit, determined not to be tethered by guilt or blackmail any longer. Behind me, I heard a choked sob, my father, perhaps. My mother said nothing, possibly too stunned to form words. With the contract proof safely tucked in my bag and the thunder rolling overhead, I headed to my car, uncertain if I would ever truly mend the fractures of this night. But one thing was certain, I was reclaiming my life, whether they liked it or not. In the days immediately following that tumultuous confrontation, my emotions vacillated between heartbreak and simmering anger. My parents, once the pillars of my childhood, were now strangers who had crossed a line I never imagined possible. Their betrayal left me reeling. At work, I found it impossible to focus. Every time I tried to concentrate on designing a marketing campaign or proofing ad copy, a cold dread seeped into my thoughts. Had they already spread rumors about me abandoning them? Would I be hit with another forged document or an unexpected legal complication? An eerie silence settled in as well. My phone stopped buzzing with frantic calls and texts from my mother. My father sent a few half-hearted apologies via text, short messages like "I'm sorry" or "We do love you," but he offered no solutions or accountability for the fraud that had taken place. In truth, I wasn't even sure what I wanted to hear from him anymore. A real apology would require owning up to the choices that dragged me into their debt spiral, yet he seemed more focused on soothing his guilt than repairing our relationship. During this emotional storm, I decided to protect myself legally. I met with a lawyer, explained the forged signature, and showed her the copies of the contract. She listened carefully, nodding at the appropriate points, then gave a heavy sigh. Family fraud cases are sticky, she said, but you have clear evidence of forgery. You have the right to press charges or at least file a complaint if this continues to escalate. Part of me balked at the idea of having my mother and father tangled in a legal battle, but another part recognized that it might be the only way to draw a boundary they couldn't ignore. I also reached out to Tessa, the friend my parents had swindled. Despite her anger and frustration, she was surprisingly supportive when I shared the entire story. "Emberly, you don't deserve this," she told me, her voice softening. "I'll admit, I blamed you at first for vouching for them, but now I see you were just as deceived. I can't imagine how you must feel." Her empathy was a lifeline. I realized I wasn't entirely alone. That night, I slept a little easier knowing someone else believed me and understood the gravity of what my parents had done. In the meantime, I made a crucial decision: to freeze my credit. My lawyer insisted it was a necessary step, and so I contacted all 3 credit bureaus, informing them of possible fraudulent activity. It was a stark reminder that even though I was their daughter, my parents were capable of damaging my financial future without a second thought. I wanted to ensure there was no next time, no other secret loans I'd unknowingly co-signed. Mentally, I tried to process the anguish of betrayal. It's not easy to reconcile memories of bedtime stories and Sunday picnics with the cold reality of fraudulent contracts and emotional blackmail. Some nights, I found myself scrolling through old family photos, tears burning in my eyes as I remembered birthdays and graduations where my mother and father had looked so proud of me. Was that affection a lie? Or were they simply too lost in their desperation to realize how deeply they were wounding me? Slowly, I came to understand that I didn't have to find a neat answer. People are complicated and capable of both love and terrible choices. My parents may still love me in their flawed way, but they crossed a boundary I cannot easily forgive. Perhaps, one day, we'll have a reckoning that leads to genuine remorse and reconciliation. For now, though, I needed distance, and the time to rebuild my sense of self without their manipulative voices in my head. Eventually, the dread began to lift. Work became a form of therapy, allowing me to channel my energy into something productive. I found comfort in the routine, pitching ideas, collaborating with coworkers, and meeting deadlines. Evenings were quieter. I spent journaling or taking long walks to clear my mind. Each step away from my parents' crisis gave me a chance to reflect, to draw a line in the sand that told the world, and myself, that I would no longer be their scapegoat. What remains is an uneasy calm, a sense that I've stepped out of a raging storm but can still hear thunder rumbling in the distance. My parents haven't fully vanished from my life. They remain an unanswered message or a late-night phone call away, but I keep them at arm's length. And if they decide to stir up more trouble, I'm finally prepared to stand my ground. In the end, I chose a resolution that balanced self-preservation with the slim hope that someday, genuine amends could be made. After freezing my credit and consulting my lawyer, I confronted my father one final time, this time alone, in a phone call. His voice was heavy with regret, but still, he made excuses for my mother, for their financial ruin. I told him calmly that until both of them took full responsibility for forging my signature and dragging me into their debts, I couldn't be part of their lives. It felt harsh to say, but it was the only boundary that made sense. In the weeks that followed, my mother stayed silent. I suspect shame, or perhaps a simmering anger that I dared to stand up for myself, kept her from reaching out. My father continued to send sporadic text messages, usually filled with apologies that skirted around accountability. Although his words softened my anger, they didn't erase the damage. I responded politely but tersely, reinforcing that my forgiveness hinged on concrete steps, paying back the people they owed, admitting to their lies, and never again using my name or reputation for their financial gain. I moved forward with my life. While the shadow of their betrayal still haunted me, my days were brighter once I set firm limits. I focused on my career, took on new projects that boosted my confidence, and even started mending relationships with friends I'd withdrawn from during the chaos. I told only a select few the full story, and each time, I felt lighter, less alone in my grief. Gradually, I realized that protecting myself didn't make me a bad daughter, it made me a responsible adult. Love is a powerful bond, but it doesn't absolve loved ones of their harmful actions. By standing my ground, I found a measure of peace. I still hold on to a quiet hope that one day, my parents will recognize the magnitude of what they did. Perhaps we'll rebuild trust on honest ground. If not, I've learned that sometimes the healthiest step forward is letting go, carrying the memories of what once was, and resolving never to let someone else's mistakes define your future. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. Sometimes, the hardest stories to tell are the ones closest to our hearts, especially when they involve family. But knowing there are others out there who've been betrayed, or who stood up for themselves, reminds me that none of us are truly alone. If you've ever faced a similar situation or discovered shocking family secrets, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How did you handle the pain, and what helped you move forward? Your stories can be a source of strength and encouragement for everyone watching. Don't forget to hit that like button if this video resonates with you, and please consider subscribing to the channel. By subscribing, you'll never miss another story about betrayal, resilience, and the power of finding your voice. Thank you again for being here. Your support means more than you know. And remember, no matter what challenges you face, even when those challenges come from the people closest to you, you have the right to set boundaries and protect your future. Stay strong, stay true to yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.